I am, other way, from the Center for Sustainable Building Research, which is part of the College of Design at the university. We work in a variety of platforms around the state, including state building guidelines, in which some of you may be familiar. The state has the B3 2030 project, which is used for all the buildings that are funded through bonding for the state. Those guidelines and the tracking of that information, as Allison is familiar with this, is done in partnership with our office. It's housed in our office and done in partnership with other organizations. We have also for a long time done research on windows and glazing. So if you have ever seen a fact sheet from the Efficient Windows Collaborative, or you've seen an NFRC seal on a brand new window, chances are we had a hand in creating that. So that's through a partnership at the national level with the Department of Energy. Long-standing relationship that we've had with them, and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I'm here because my area of focus is affordable housing, and I'm going to talk a lot about that today. We take a building science approach, which is getting down to this building evaluation area, a building science approach to sustainability and building construction and evaluation. So whereas the futurists might be thinking about possible future, we're trying to understand the present and the present construction systems and create more sustainable options moving forward. This is just a little bit of a repeat. All of the information and so much more that I'm going to be talking about tonight is on our housing website. So there's a link here that you can catch from the PDF. But the Minnesota Sustainable Housing Initiative was funded, or continues to be funded, by the McKnight Foundation. And we work with for-profit, but primarily nonprofit developers of affordable housing across the state. We've developed an online knowledge base that has analysis and recommendations for construction systems all the way down, as well as in some environmental topics, guideline support for the state's guidelines, and case studies. So I'm going to jump around a little bit. General knowledge base, so if you're kind of curious about the impacts housing has on these particular environmental topics, you can check it out. The support for the state guidelines for affordable housing, which I'm going to talk about more in depth. And as I said, there's analysis and recommendations for different types of construction systems. In this case, this example is for a wall system. The analysis would include alternatives, what is typical, cooling and heating energy response for the different options, simple payback, life cycle assessment, life cycle payback, material impacts. So it's a really thorough analysis of different building material options and assemblies. Like I said, some of this gets a little bit geeky. So coming back to our mission, so the most common definition of sustainability is development that meets the needs of the current day without compromising future generations to meet their own needs. This is the one that gets bandied about. Sustainability and green is really, kind of in the zeitgeist now. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody kind of thinks they know what it means. Everybody has a definition of what it means. We are trying to help people make informed decisions from data. So that is our goal. We are always talking about not just the planet, which is what we typically think of as the green issue, but equity issues from manufacturers to the people who are living in the homes that we're thinking about, to the economics. So in particular in the affordable arena, we are really conscious of the economics. There's only so much money that can be put into affordable housing. But we are really trying to balance these issues. As way of a little background, so major impacts that buildings and people have on the natural environment. Buildings use 1/6 to 1/2 of the world's wood, minerals, water, and energy. And buildings generate 40% of waste that goes into landfill. So it's a big chunk. of environmental degradation. They're blamed for much of the environmental damage today, destruction of forests, rivers, off-flow. It's a significant issue. Many buildings do harm on the inside as well. And so one of the studies that I'm going to be highlighting actually shows a health impact study that we did in an affordable housing project here in Minnesota. We have the second one going on now, but I'm going to look at the first one tonight. Go back again, I'm trying to talk fast. Inside as well, making both less healthy and less productive. 30% of commercial buildings constructed in the 60s are unhealthy. One of our colleagues at the University of Minnesota, who's now a colleague of Allison's, Mary Lou Cheppel, did a study of new construction homes and found that the durability and impact on health was decreased markedly in new homes that were less than 10 years old. Her study is now 15 years old, but these are significant issues, which is why we're trying to take a data-driven building science approach to some of these solutions.
Did you just say that the new housing is less healthy?
Yes. Yeah, the housing built in the 90s is got some significant problems. Anybody who wants the study, I can dig it up for you. So what are the overarching issues and why do we care about sustainability? Our approach is we're just consuming too much. So this is the trend, number of days per year that we spend in ecological deficit. So here's a year. Everything above that line, as you can see, starts to trend above that line out here, is really looking at what our deficit spending is from an ecological standpoint. So that is energy that's generated from the planet. So living on current resources, the ability of the planet to absorb pollutants and toxins, we're overshooting. So what we're really trying to move to with things like net zero energy buildings, net zero water buildings perhaps, is to try and better align what our current ecological income is, if you think about it that way, with what our spending is. So that's our goal with sustainability from the center's perspective, just to be clear. Last year, we went into deficit spending on August 22nd. So we're really over-capitalizing, pulling more capital out than is being renewed in the system. This probably won't surprise a lot of you, but the US is deficit spending a little bit faster than the rest of the world. So our lifestyle, which is actually pretty interesting. If you go in and play around with some of the calculators, you realize that how we build our cities and our dependence on the automobile really drives a lot of this. Our houses are bigger, we drive more, we move around a lot more. The country itself is bigger. It's a big country that is pretty sparsely populated when you really get down to it. So our kind of internal fixed costs of energy are pretty high in the country the way that we've developed it as an auto-dependent enterprise. So I always say I teach in the School of Architecture, as well as being a researcher, I teach in the School of Architecture, Design, and Technology. We need to move from a consumption model to a utilization model. So how many things can we do that push us in this direction? The primary way in which people make an impact on sustainable building is through guideline systems. So there are several really big guideline systems that are out there. LEED, has anybody heard of LEED? USGBC, okay. LEED's the big leader in this area on a national basis. Green Globes is another national one. The Minnesota Sustainable Building Guidelines, which is the B3 and Minnesota 2030, which is the program that I was mentioning in my introduction. Actually, the program that jumped off from is about the same age as LEED. So it's the latest generation and went from being county-driven to being state-driven. But they're about the same age. And the Living Building Challenge, which I'm going to talk about very briefly, is the latest. And I'll kind of explain the direction. Has anybody heard of Living Building Challenge? The futurists should hear about Living Building Challenge. Can kind of go and see kind of the evolution of building guidelines, and it pretty closely, we get into this proliferation in the last few years as this becomes more of an issue and people are talking about it more, and it's not a matter of do we have an ecological problem, but we've got one, so what are we going to do about it? A lot of people are trying to establish means for tackling some of these issues. Looking just at housing, so LEED has a LEED for Homes process. The National Association of Home Builders has a certification process. Our local BAM, so Builders Association of Minnesota, and in a partnership with BATSI, which is the Builders Association of the Twin Cities, also have one called Green Path, which is really new and it's not on the slide. Green Communities Program, which is a national program adopted by Minnesota, and I'm going to talk about that. Austin Green Building Program is here because it's the granddaddy. Every house that's built in Austin, Texas meets a green standard. So, and they've been doing it for 20 years. Minnesota Green Star is a homegrown project and guideline system primarily for renovation. So very specifically trying to look at that. They have new building guidelines, but it really is a renovation program. So again, the same trend that we saw on the overall, we see here in the housing as well. Proliferation of different programs leads to some confusion in the marketplace. We think it's going to sort itself out. So some recent trends, as I grab my water. Recent trends are diverse sets of guidelines and ratings are continuing to evolve. Guidelines becoming adopted by states and municipalities and required by municipalities and codes. This is kind of a current way in which people are getting sustainability built in. So individual municipalities in Minnesota can't adopt codes that are stronger than the state code, but when cities put money in, they can add requirements, and that's what this is primarily doing in the second bullet point. We're moving away from simple point checklists to outcome-based systems. We're starting to include life cycle assessment from materials, so we're not just focusing on energy and water conservation, we're actually looking at impact from materials. And there's an increased focus on performance. One big trend, and Minnesota has its own 2030 program, but Ed Mazria, who was a big advocate for solar architecture after the oil crisis in the early 70s, came around again in I think 2002 and established the Architecture 2030 program, recognizing that buildings account for 48% of energy consumption in the country, either operationally or through embodied energy. And his suggestion was that we should immediately begin to set targets to reach net zero buildings by 2030, essentially by knocking off a percentage every 5 years in order to decrease that trend. Minnesota has its own program. Again, it's required for state buildings. It's optional in some municipalities that have adopted it as well. So we have targets now in Minnesota to meet the 2030 challenge to create new construction buildings that will be net zero ready by 2030. When I say net zero ready, I mean that they will be at a point where their energy consumption will be low enough that you could feasibly use renewables to meet the rest of that energy need. It's roughly akin to 15% of current. So it's not insignificant. So key issues, thinking about biocentric versus anthropocentric approaches to building and construction. Relative versus absolute targets, so really establishing targets that are absolute based on current income, again, ecological income. Voluntary market-based approaches versus code requirements. Both of these are still playing out. It remains to be seen how that's going to play out. Self-assessment and third-party certification. We think it's really important that if you implement a green program, that you have third-party certification. You're not taking somebody's word for it. Somebody's actually going and making sure that it's done. Looking at actual monitoring post-construction, point-based versus requirement approach, so really creating requirements as opposed to having people chase points. There's arguments for both. Point-based is really flexible, and that might be good in the market. Adaptability to different project types, focus on energy and water versus broader scope. So we tend to focus a lot on energy. People are concerned about CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions, but the other issues in the building pipeline are also important to think about. Living Building Challenge is a zero-sum guideline. So there are a couple projects in Minnesota that are looking at this. I'm working on one with a nonprofit developer where we're using it as a guideline. We know that we're not going to hit it. We're not going to make it, but it's actually 47 blocks that way, or that way. It's at Franklin in Portland. And we're going through and trying to see how far we can push each of the initiatives. But in this case, the energy goal is net zero energy. Okay, we're really trying to figure out how can you do a net zero energy building in an urban context. It's very hard, just for the record. And they also have a goal of net zero water. And we're asking ourselves whether or not we think that's appropriate in an urban context. Should we really be getting a net zero water as a target? So some of these are philosophical questions that are still in debate. Overall, metrics and buildings are moving from kind of point-based systems to really trying to understand their impact on the environment. The current scope in affordable housing in Minnesota is based on the Enterprise Green Communities criteria. Little background, in 2005, Minnesota Green Communities pilot project was launched in which the Green Communities national program was piloted here on several projects that got some additional grant funding. We're actually going to look at a couple of those because they're in this presentation. In 2007, Minnesota Housing moved to require those green community criteria for all their projects that are funded. So currently, if you get funds from the LIHTC application, so the low-income housing tax credits, the same tax credit system that the Illinois example was, you're required to do green communities. There are some modifications. We call it green communities with Minnesota overlay. There are some modifications put on by the state to make it more Minnesota user-friendly and relevant. So they first required for just new construction in 2007. Now it's required for all the program funds that they have. The program is a points-based system. So in this case, you can kind of see this as a water conserving fixtures. You have to do it. It's a mandatory criteria. You have to do all the mandatory criteria. But it kind of goes through and limits the flow rates. So this is an older system. It's based on point chasing, quote unquote. It still creates a lot of good initiative, and the mandatory criteria really help push the initiative forward. But it's that older idea of getting points for doing things as opposed to an outcome-based system. There are mandatory is required by everybody. There are some optional points that are required to beef up the new construction and multifamily. There's an online certification system that is not required by the state of Minnesota, but is highly recommended, and it actually streamlines the process, and you can use it in that way. So kind of jumping quickly into some examples of projects. We have been tracking the Green Communities pilot projects for a number of years to see what their outcomes were and trying to understand were the criteria having an impact. What was the impact they were having? So typical new construction, this is just a measure of energy. We talk about energy use intensity as a number, but you can just think of it as a relative scale. Typical new construction is about 100. It's 100 kBTUs per square foot per year, if you really want to know. But you can think about it just as 100. And these are all Green Communities projects, and you can see that all of them are coming in underneath that that line, including these bottom 3, which are renovation projects, which were very successful. We're going to take a quick peek at Viking, Terrace, and Wellstone. That translates into cost, which of course is a big deal. How much does it cost to heat, cool, and light an apartment in the affordable market? That's part of the whole cost of housing. The Wellstone, which again is actually across the street from our current project, it's at Franklin and Portland, is a 49-unit apartment building. It's pretty conventional. So this is about using conventional construction and just doing it better. It went through a commissioning process, and really attention was paid to how the building went together. But it's just an R19 wall and, you know, heavily insulated roof. It's not that special in construction. It does have a solar hot water with gas-fired backup. You can see that we went through and measured it in brief. 100 is our mark. This 61.1 is the Minnesota 2030 target. So in this case, it came in underneath that target. It wasn't required to look at that target, but we're using that as a benchmark. You can see the breakdown of energy, what's natural gas and what's electric through the course of the year. It's not a big surprise. The big bump is winter. And then looking again about comparing the different utilities and who's paying what. So this is of interest to developers as they're trying to decide how their utilities are going to be mapped out within their buildings. Another thing, because we're really interested in how buildings operate, is matching floor over floor to see they should be really on par with one another. And what you see is that the first floor is paying for a lot more heat. And if you want cheap heat, you should live on the 3rd floor. So this is where building physics get into the building. It's kind of where the rubber meets the road. Wind blows, there's stack effect, there's heat loss, there's more envelope on the top floor. These all have these impacts. So it's the geek slide. We also look at water. In this case, we have a model that we built. The model should be about 70 gallons per person per day. The way that their fixtures are rated, they should be at 41, 42, but they're at 72.5. So people will mess up your building every time. So people come in, they have different living patterns, they're doing different things. So trying to understand what that is and why that is also part of the research that we do. Just quickly looking at the solar array for hot water. It's 24 panels. You can actually see it from the street if you're coming, you see the back of it if you're coming this way. There are 10 Solar Sky flat collector plates, and that's what they look like. It's a pretty straightforward system. They run a loop. There's a heat exchanger, and then they do thermal storage, and there's backup for gas. So in this case, this is the natural gas going on back here, and this is the solar that's being heated, that is heating the natural gas, or heating the hot water. It's a little dark. It was designed to accommodate about half of the solar hot water heater, designed to meet half of the hot water load from solar. And they couldn't figure out why it wasn't working. Well, in the end, we realized they were using twice as much water as they thought they were when we really started to kind of dig into how the analysis was put together. But it also, so annually, it meets 26.2, but their water consumption is twice what it was. So it actually functions pretty well for the way that it was designed. It's just not meeting the load because the load is much bigger than what they thought. It's interesting to see in winter, it actually is only supplying about 17.3% of the energy for the hot water. So not a big surprise. Summer, it's really close to 50. You can kind of see a trend. This is the year over a week, all sorts of geek data. So the difference between you know, what's available and what's needed, and then the same, so a lot more gas in winter. Very quickly, so quickly, I want to just talk about the Viking Terrace apartment. So the Viking Terrace apartment is a renovation, rehab of a 1970s era building. It's 3 buildings. It was one of the pilot projects for green communities, and there's some cost information here. But the green community's incremental cost was about 15% of the project cost. So we talk about the cost of green. This was completed in 2007. Most of what we would think of as that 15% now is really starting to be suppressed. It's really to 2 or 3%, just because the way we think of buildings has changed, particularly in renovation. A lot of the incremental cost was for things that nobody was doing in rehab at the time, and now everybody's doing them. So it's really brought those costs down. A little bit more breakout on costs if you want to look at it. How this project, you can see, this is all the projects from that year across the country. Minnesota's Viking Terrace is over there. You can see it was one of the most expensive from incremental cost. Partly too, it's because we were really honest about what costs we reported. We go back to this kind of pre-rehab, we were at 72.4. Post-rehab, we were at 39. And so you can see, and actually the building challenge benchmark. So this is an interesting point. So before it was 100, and then you saw the benchmark was 60. These are the national benchmarks for our region. So when Minnesota adopted Minnesota benchmarks for a really good reason, the region that we're included in goes down to Kansas. So the energy profiles in buildings in Kansas is very different than the energy profiles in buildings in Minneapolis, let alone up in Bemidji. So when you think about that, so we've adopted our own guidelines that are very region specific. And they're more realistic, and they're actually kind of better founded in data. So, but this is an older slide, and so you see that older reference point to the old number. So, but you see, it's 46% better than it was before. It's a ground source heat pump for the system, and so the carbon isn't in line with that. It uses still significant carbon reduction, but it's not the same as the overall energy reduction because electricity, which now runs the pumps, is dirtier than if we just burn natural gas to heat it. Water consumption, average. So again, we were using national averages, and now we've kind of retooled our meters. So you could think about that as being 70, but it's down at 43 where it should be. I really wanted to show this because of the health stuff. So here's after, those are before pictures. Here is kind of, it really was falling apart before, and now it's new. They're actually really nice apartments. We partnered with the National Center for Healthy Housing to look at the health implications of green. This was one of the first studies in the country that did this, and really looked at, it was families, so we were looking at children and adults and their impact on health. And most people, you can always see there's some people who feel worse. It's like the people who are more uncomfortable when they get new windows. It's a statistical thing. It's just one of those funny things. But the majority of people either felt the same or had improved health, and this tracks actually with the larger data set. We also did this building evaluation. If you want to know how buildings actually work, you can kind of dig into this. Lots of interesting stuff. Comfort in apartment. So again, this was something that we were able to measure. 73% of people in this renovated complex were more comfortable. It was a gut rehab, so it's a good thing they were more comfortable. Kind of looking at super geek stuff. Radon in Minnesota is a really significant issue, and so we had high radon levels here. There was radon mitigation. We have an active system, so here's with the system turned off, and then we turn the system on and our radon level goes down. So it's kind of an interesting thing that they work, which is a good thing. Actually, some consequences of that was we actually had better quality and drier air in the basement units from that. Just so you think that we're not just looking at energy and water, there's an analysis of life cycle analysis for the Viking Terrace, showing that there is kind of a significant benefit to renovating buildings when possible and when feasible. Across from, these are the major indicators for that assessment on the other page to think about those renovation impacts. Again, more of the same. So things that we're learning is that, third-party certification for guideline programs is really a critical step. And following through with commissioning, which is making sure that everything is operating correctly, is also a really critical step. So I just wanted to show you quick, there's single family stuff that I'm breezing through here, but it is in the PDF if you're interested. Similar information. One thing that when we were talking about impacts for communities and some of the other questions that came up with regards to density, we currently have a program we're working with nonprofit developers and some communities on building capacity upstream, really trying to impact the first part of design to lead to better outcomes. So 80% of energy is locked in with your first 5 design decisions. So we're trying to get folks to think about it when it's the napkin sketch phase. So our nonprofit developers said, that would be great, you should do that program. I want to be able to analyze a napkin sketch. Okay. So we created the system where we started to think about tools for picking sites and optimizing sites. And this is on our website as well, and it might be interesting when you're thinking about livability. But targeting 10-minute evaluation, thinking about a site in a number of ways. And it has a site selection tool that lets you think about stormwater management, site, and energy, as well as livability issues, so transportation, density, amenity, and kind of these things, at a rule of thumb scale with quick uptake. Kind of digging in more. Uses things like walk score, things that are accessible, but pulls that information together. And then does a little worksheet for assessment on site for site optimization. So that's it. Oh, this is the next health study, I was just going to say, is an elderly apartment renovation. And we're in our last year of that study, so those outcomes will be coming soon. But that was also a renovation. It was in Mankato. At Ornest Plaza. It's a 1970s 7-story concrete, complete concrete. It's a brutalist. I'm an architect, so brutalism is actually a thing in architecture. It's brutalist. But now it's not anymore. So it was a really significant rehab.
Where was the Viking Terrace project?
Yeah, sorry, I guess I blew by that. The Viking Terrace project was done by the Southwest Minnesota Housing Partnership, and it's in Worthington, Minnesota. The single family stuff that I flew by was part of a study where we essentially worked with Habitat for Humanity, but there's a lot of good outcome stuff related to different building types and outcomes. Sorry.
Oh, I was actually, there was a slide in the low 80s that talked about
in the low
new
80s.
construction versus redeveloped construction. I just wanted to get another look at that.
Yeah. Oh, the overall?
Yes.
That was way back. So I think you had a question earlier about the single family. This one?
No, it was.
I think it was in regard to the cost, the life cycle cost of.
Oh, sure. Oh, the LCA. Yeah. Sorry.
Do you need the slide? to
This
answer the
one?
question?
No, that wasn't it.
What's the question?
I just wanted to get a look at it.
Oh,
It's on the, this one?
Yes, renovation versus new construction.
Yeah. So it's global warming potential, primary energy, which is embodied energy, water pollution, air pollution, and weighted resource, which is a measure of resource deletion, use. Yeah.
I work in the State Historic Preservation Office. I can confirm that. It's the greenest building is the one that already exists. By tearing it down, the amount of resources to replace it and everything has a much bigger impact on the environment. So. The other thing is renovating a building also creates more jobs than building new. That's the other thing
Well, that's interesting.
You really covered a tremendous amount of
I
information.
know. Sorry, that was too much.
No, that was great. I want to come back to the fact that there are a number of funding agencies that are interested in what the performance measures should be
Yes.
for projects that they fund.
Yep.
And I believe that you said Minnesota Housing Finance Agency was one of those. Can you give the group a sense of, if there's to be new affordable housing built and there's public financing in it, what's the likelihood that one of these measures of environmental performance will be a requirement?
It will be. So the way that it just, in fact, renovation for the most part, if you are doing a substantial renovation, that will kick in as well. So it will have to follow the green communities criteria with the Minnesota overlay for any project. And then there are certain projects that are exempt because they're bonded, but if you're a bonded project, you have to follow B3. I keep looking over there because she's in commerce.
So part of your funding comes from the McKnight Foundation, right?
The funding for the research and the support that we've been offering to nonprofits and generating feedback loops, people are, what's working, what's not working, that is funded by the McKnight Foundation.
And the McKnight Foundation funds the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency and other groups that participate in.
Yes, so the McKnight also funds the Family Housing Fund and the Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, and the Family Housing Fund does supportive, in the metro area, is a supportive arm. They're grant making.
I was just going to add that the Minnesota Housing Finance Authority is a state agency.
Right.
So funded by all of us.
Right.
Right.
So the point I'm trying to make is new affordable housing is going to be held to a higher standard of,
Right.
in regards to energy conservation and all of these
Right.
issues. And part of what you're doing is the evaluation of what's working and the ability to change and improve those standards
Yeah.
over time.
So we work on two ends. We tend to get involved with teams in setting their goals and creating interdisciplinary teams to meet the challenge. Particularly, some people are coming to us and saying, we really want to do a building that rethinks how we are doing development. So we do that kind of work. And then on the back end, we do actual measurement and verification. Yeah?
Could you also speak maybe to the trend of, my background's commercial construction and development, and I would say that there's more of a trend in voluntarily meeting these guidelines, either from a, long-term cost benefit analysis
Sure.
as a operator, because you're not just looking at first cost, but you're looking at life cycle. And then also, even now that green is cool from a marketing standpoint, a lot of Class A office buildings have gone back
Sure.
and got LEED certification and things like that.
So I think unless there's an affordable housing component, and actually some of the affordable housing projects are doing the same thing, they'll get dual certification because their city administrator wants it to be a LEED project, so they end up doing both. But in the market rate, definitely LEED for new construction, LEED mid-rise, and LEED low-rise will both get involved with housing, come into that housing market. And we're seeing it as, the more people are doing it, the costs are coming down, the quality of building and energy consumption is coming up. I mean, consumption is going down.
Process, and so a lot of developers will do a lot of the things that would be required to get LEED certified, but just choose to not go through the process and spend the money. And the other thing that we hear a lot from developer clients, I chair the Sustainable Development Council at ULI, so there's a lot of developers on that council that are involved in sustainable projects. whether or not their customers are demanding those environmental features, you know, that's across the board. We're not quite there yet. But a lot of what they do is market their projects as just better buildings.
Sure.
That it's a better building, it's more energy efficient, and so part of the challenge is what story do you tell to try and get traction with the
Right.
customers?
And this isn't going to come as a surprise, we push for people to actually get certified through whatever program they're using, because it's putting the proof out there, and you're saying that yes, we not only are we saying we're doing these things, we are doing these things, and these are the outcomes that we're getting. LEED for homes and green communities align pretty well. So if you had an affordable housing component, so you had a mix, so you had, you know, in one development, they're pretty compatible with one another, particularly in the area of energy, which uses the Energy Star system through the EPA for most of those targets.
The other change that's happening really quickly in the last few years is lenders taking into account the energy savings in projects and factoring that into the financing on the project.
We haven't really seen that as a trend
I can
yet.
show you several examples.
I would
nationally.
think that would be
Yeah.
great, because one of the things that I think people are really interested in is being able to effectively and consistently capitalize their future savings to make those investments. And we have not seen it go to any kind of scale. It's like the trend, you know, trends in construction systems and different methods of construction. You know, when does a trend go to scale? It needs to hit a certain tipping point where it becomes commonplace.
That's actually interesting. But no, one of the things is, though, is that I do believe that it is a selling point for upscale housing, being LEED certified and green. They are building a 232 unit, all luxury housing next to Southdale.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be LEED certified green building. And so it doesn't have to be affordable in order for it to be.
Absolutely.
You know, unfortunately, it's outside of Richfield School District, but it's very cool, just right next to it.
Well, and I think that is it. So I think people are on board, people are starting to push, and you know, I think one of the things, and USGBC Minnesota is also doing this, the Minnesota chapter, is really going back and saying, how are our buildings doing? And trying to verify that they're really meeting the targets that they're setting. Because there's been some hullabaloo about green buildings not actually being better, and particularly at the national level. We haven't really had that dust up here, but USGBC Minnesota is trying to get out there and go back and audit their buildings and see, well, how are they really doing, which I think is great. Of course, I'm very pro, like, let's say these are the things that are working and let's repeat those, and these are the things that don't work and let's not do that again, or fix it.
That kind of segues, I think, into my question. I'm not in the building trades at all, so you're going to have to help me understand here, but you had mentioned about newer housing being unhealthy. And so with these green certifications and requirements, how do they compare? I'm assuming that unhealthy means because of air exchange or the materials through which our water is passing, things like that.
So, and I'm on tape, so I have to be really careful about this. I'm kidding. There was a very specific era of housing construction that the buildings in the way that they were being constructed were starting to tighten up for energy efficiency, but the air exchange and the other measures hadn't kicked in yet. So it was something that was recognized very quickly and corrected. So that the building new, when I say new, it's just newer. I mean, our housing stock is very old, but there was this point in time where there were some significant problems in the construction of homes. And it was this trade-off where people didn't understand necessarily the implications of some of the energy savings things on the whole system. So a house is a system, you know, and so they changed one thing and it had unintended consequences. It was discovered really quickly, and they made changes to code and the way that buildings go together and solve that problem. What we like to think about when we're thinking about indoor air quality is not just the air exchange, but also thinking about materials that are being introduced, things, off-gassing, and then things that people are bringing in. You can build a green building, but if people come in with, you know, I don't want to mention a brand, but, you know, cheap furniture that is, you know,
Maybe Scandinavian.
smells new, you know, that's off-gassing. And so you're introducing. So it really is kind of working that whole thing and trying to get people to be more conscious of what they're doing in their environment. And even some cleaning fluids and cleaning supplies can create unhealthy air, you know, so thinking all the way up and down.
Final question?